Welcome to Anatomy and Physiology 1. This is going to be our first lecture, Chapter 1, and this is going to be an introduction to the human body. The purpose of this chapter is going to be to introduce the disciplines of anatomy and physiology. We're going to discuss the organization of the human body, reveal shared properties of all living things, and discuss the major concept of anatomy and physiology, which is homeostasis. Let's start pretty simple and define what anatomy and physiology really means. To define anatomy and physiology, anatomy is the study of structure, whereas physiology is the study of how body parts function. So Table 1.1 goes through selected branches of anatomy and physiology. I'm not going to go through all of them, but please have a look through. We will highlight some of the important ones. So we can start at embryology. Again, it is the structure, what's going on within the first 8 weeks of development. Cell biology we will look at, which is cellular structure and functions. Histology is going to be a word we're going to use again and again throughout AP1 and AP2, which is analyzing the microscopic structure of tissues. Gross anatomy is structures that can be examined without a microscope. Systemic anatomy, so structures of specific body systems. Regional anatomy. And one of the most important ones is here, surface anatomy. So surface anatomy is really important because we make a comparison. I make a comparison to building a building, right? When you build a building, the first thing you have to do is lay the foundation. A strong foundation allows you to build a strong building. A weak foundation means that building is going to crumble over time and is not sustainable. So surface marking, surface terms, surface anatomy is that. It is our foundational terms. It's our foundation to everything we're going to do for AP1 and AP2. So make sure you memorize these. And we're going to look at these again throughout this lecture and the next one. So surface anatomy are surface markings of the body to understand internal anatomy through visualization and palpation. Next is imaging anatomy, which is using clinical techniques like X-rays, MRIs, CAT scans to look at the body, and pathological anatomy. So when we talk about pathology, we're talking about disease. Physiology. So there's different types of physiology. Neurophys, endocrinology, cardiovascular phys, immunology, respiratory phys, renal phys. These are all functions. Look at that word here. Function, 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 functions of these systems. And then last we have pathophys, which is functional changes associated with disease and aging. Levels of structural organization and body systems. Let's use a picture to understand the levels of structural organization in the human body. We start at our smallest components, which is the chemical level. So we start right here at number 1. Some of the atoms include carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. We can combine these chemicals to form DNA. Our DNA will give rise to our next level of organization, which is the cellular level. Now, why is the cellular level important? Not all cells are created the same. While their parts may be similar, their shape, size, and arrangement will be different. When you put these cells together, they give rise to our tissue level. So we talk about tissues, we could talk about muscle tissue, we could talk about cardiac tissue, we could talk about tendons and adipose and all these various types of tissues. Now we could put those tissues together and this is going to give rise to our organ level. For example, we have our stomach here, okay? And then we could put our organ systems together and it's going to give rise to systems. So we're dealing with our systemic level. So with our stomach, we deal with the digestive system. Now we take all of our systems and we put it together and we get our organismal level, being us, a human. Systems of the human body. There are 11 systems of the human body. This includes the integumentary system. This is our skin. Our skeletal system, bones. Muscular system, muscle. Nervous system, nerves. Endocrine, hormones. Cardiovascular system, heart, blood vessels, movement of blood throughout the body. Lymphatic system, which deals with immunity. Respiratory system, breathing. Digestive system, food, absorption of nutrients. Urinary system, deals with removing waste, dealing with water retention or removal through the body. Waste management. And reproductive, we leave for propagating our species, making gametes, sex cells, like sperm and ovums, to make unique new individuals. Let's use table 1.2 to look at our 11 body systems from a diagrammatic perspective. Look at the integumentary system. So we start right here. 1. We see we're talking about hair, fingernails, toenails, sweat glands, oil glands, our skin, etc. And look at its function. Protecting. We're protecting our body from pathogens, from bacteria, from dirt, debris, from everything around us. We're going to regulate body temperature. It also will eliminate some waste. Think about sweating. We're going to use the sunlight to help synthesize vitamin D. Vitamin D is going to be important for bone density and helping grow bones. We're going to detect stimuli, touch, pain, hot, cold. And we help store fat, which is going to provide insulation. That brings us to our second system, the skeletal system. Bones. This is the framework of our body. It provides support, it protects, it gives us movement, and it's going to make red blood cells, as well as store minerals and lipids or fats. Our next system is our muscular system, number 3. This is going to deal with our muscles, smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, and cardiac muscle. These muscles are going to participate in body movements, walking, maintaining posture, producing heat. Smooth muscle will help move food and stuff through our digestive tract, also guarding entrances and exits as we think of sphincters, and cardiac muscle to run the heart. The majority of muscle we're going to look at in our body is going to be skeletal muscle. So this is voluntary contraction. These are things that deal with movement of our body parts, walking, etc. Our fourth system is the nervous system, and we're dealing with the brain, the spinal cord, nerves, special sense organs like our eyes and ears. These structures are going to generate action potential, nerve impulses, to regulate body activities. They're going to propagate the stimuli detected from the integument system, move it to the central nervous system to elicit a response. So we're detecting changes in body's internal and the external environment. We're interpreting changes and responding by causing skeletal muscle contractions or glandular secretions. It could also be smooth muscle contractions as well with digestion. Our fifth body system here is the endocrine system. This is everything hormones. So we're regulating body activities by releasing hormones in the blood, targeting other glands or tissues. The sixth system is the cardiovascular system. It is the heart and all associated blood vessels. This functions to carry oxygen, nutrients to cells, and carbon dioxide and waste away from cells. It helps regulate acid-base balances, temperatures, water content of body fluids, blood components like white blood cells to help fight against disease and repair damaged blood vessels. Our seventh system is the lymphatic system. Think of this like our sewer system of our body. Its job is to remove waste, remediate waste, and clean our system. It's going to return proteins and fluids to the blood. It's going to help carry lipids from gastrointestinal tract to the blood. It's going to contain sites of maturation and proliferation of B cells and T cells. These are lymphatic cells for immunity. Our eighth system is our respiratory system. This is everything breathing. Oxygen loading, oxygen unloading, carbon dioxide loading and unloading to the lungs, to the tissues. So dealing with transfer of oxygen from air to blood and carbon dioxide from blood to the air exhaled. Our ninth system is the digestive system. So this is our alimentary canal. This includes everything along that track from mouth to anus, including accessory organs like the liver, the gallbladder. But we're dealing mostly with the esophagus, the stomach, the small and large intestines, and the anus. Its job is to achieve physical and chemical breakdown of food, absorb nutrients, and eliminate waste as solid. Our 10th system is the urinary system. So we're talking about our kidneys, our ureters, our bladder, and our urethra. Its function is to produce, store, and eliminate urine, eliminating waste and regulate volumes and chemical compositions of our blood. It also helps to maintain the acid-base balance of fluids in the body, maintains body mineral balance, and help regulate the production of red blood cells. Yes, the same red blood cells that were made in our skeletal system, in our bones. Our 11th and last system is the reproductive system. So we're talking about our gonads, our testes in the male and penis, as well as our vagina, uterus, and ovaries in the female. Our goal is to make gametes, sex cells, sperm or oocytes that unite to form a new organism. We will also talk about the release of hormones that regulate reproduction and other body processes. What makes living human organisms living? So we are going to look at the characteristics of the living organism. So we have a few key definitions for basic life processes. Number one, all living things have certain characteristics that distinguish them from non-living things. Life processes in humans include metabolism, the ability for our cells to use energy to do work. We talk about words like basal metabolic rate. We link this with the endocrine system and the digestive system for overall growth and cellular respiration, cell work. Next is responsiveness. We have to be able to respond, meaning there's constant stimuli coming in and out of our body. Hot, cold, pain, touch, constant touch, pressure. All these stimuli have to be interpreted by the body and then respond. For example, a simple reflex. If you touch a hot stove, the receptors in our skin detect hot, then pain, sends an action potential up your arm to your brain. The brain interprets it and then responds by pulling it away very quickly. That's responsiveness. Next is movement, walking, maintaining posture, right? Through our skeletal system, our skeletal muscle, and other basic life processes. Growth. From birth till death, we are constantly growing. Differentiation. This is one of our most interesting ones. The body undergoes many different types of differentiation. The best example are blood cells in our bones. All blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, and all the different variety of white blood cells all come from one cell, a pluripotent stem cell. That stem cell, through different signaling markers, can differentiate, can grow into either a red blood cell, an eosinophil is a type of white blood cell, maybe a platelet, maybe a monocyte, another type of white blood cell, maybe a lymphocyte, maybe a basophil. The differentiation that occurs here is vast. That leads us with reproduction. The ability to make sex cells, allow those sex cells to unite to form new and unique individuals. Homeostasis. When talking about anatomy and physiology in the human body, this is a monster. This is what we always come to, right? So let's define it. Homeostasis is a condition of equilibrium or balance in the body's internal environment. Homeostasis is maintained by the body's regulatory process. So what's an easy way to explain this? Think of a seesaw. Yes, a seesaw. So let's take a look at this analogy. We'll move our seesaw over into the corner. We're going to switch over to our pencil and say, okay, let's draw a seesaw. We have our fulcrum. This is our body at equilibrium, at a perfect balance. Unfortunately, this is a dynamic system. We are never perfectly stable. It is constantly changing. So what happens? We have a pressure. A pressure is going to come on and is going to change our perfectly balanced system. Our seesaw now looks like this. Now our body has to be able to respond. It has to respond to return us back into a state of homeostasis. What we're outlining is called a negative feedback. Basically what happens is we respond to a disruption in homeostasis, we apply a new pressure or a fix that's going to allow us to return back to a balanced condition. The best example is temperature. If the temperature is too cold, the body will start to respond. So temperature gets too cold, we enter into a state like this, an imbalance. The body responds by shivering. The shivering helps to produce heat. That heat production helps to bring us back to a level balanced state of equilibrium or homeostasis. That is our seesaw. Again, what we've been outlining is a negative feedback loop. There are also positive feedback loop, which means that instead of responding to a disruption, a positive feedback loop causes the disruption. And then the body would respond to return back to equilibrium or homeostasis. Body fluids and homeostasis. The survival of our body cells is dependent on precise regulation of the chemical composition of the surrounding fluid, known as the extracellular fluid, or the fluid in the interstitium, or interstitial fluid. We can look at our digestive system, where nutrients are being ingested, the body is breaking them down into the smallest components, and those nutrients are being moved into the blood supply. The heart is going to distribute those, so we see carbon dioxide moving out, oxygen moving in, and as we move through our system, we hit a part in our internal environment, our systemic capillary system. So all those tissues and the organs within our body. Our body cells are going to exchange the oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, and nitrogenous wastes. All those wastes are going to move to the urinary system to be excreted out our urine. So we're dealing with external environment versus internal environment. Control of homeostasis. An elaboration on what we just looked at with our last seesaw example. Homeostasis. Homeostatic imbalances occur because of disruptions from the external or internal environment. There are some interactive animations that you could click on through your PowerPoint, not mine, but through your PowerPoint, that will bring you to some negative feedback loops. The example we used before was temperature regulation. This will give you another visual example. Here is the basic feedback loop of a disruption in homeostasis. So we start with the stimulus. Again, we are outlining a negative feedback loop. Now, the majority of our feedback loops are negative. So we have disruption in homeostasis by increasing or decreasing a controlled condition. This is being monitored by receptors in our body. They can be to the periphery in our skin, or it can be deep in our viscera, in our internal organs. The input is going to be sent through nervous signals, so nervous impulses or chemical signals to the control center of the brain. That control center is going to receive the input and provide nerve impulses or chemical signals to effectors as output. Those effectors will elicit a response. That change is going to alter the controlled condition. This is our response. That brings us back to homeostasis when we get back into our normal aligned condition. So again, think of that seesaw. We are pushing down on that seesaw, making it imbalanced here. We are detecting that imbalance. We are saying, hey, let's add some weight to bring that balance back to normal. Our output applies the weight, we get it back to balance, and we return to homeostasis. Let's look at a physical example of negative feedback loop. So the stimulus, a disruption in homeostasis by increasing blood pressure. So we are increasing blood pressure. Remember, typical normal blood pressure for a healthy individual is about 120 over 70 or 80. So let's assume we went up to 160 over 90. So we elevate the blood pressure. We have baroreceptors. So we say, well, what are baroreceptors? Think of a barometer. It is detecting pressure changes in our atmosphere. So this is the same things. These are receptors that detect pressure. So in our blood vessels, we have these baroreceptors that detect that high blood pressure. It sends nerve impulses to the control center or the brain that's going to send output response. The output response is going to be to adjust the lumen or the diameter of the blood vessels leaving the heart. What this does is it widens those blood vessels, causing blood pressure to decrease. So by vasodilating, we are actually artificially decreasing blood pressure until we return back to a normal homeostatic condition. So what can cause this disruption? Fight or flight, right? Our sympathetic nervous system. You get into a scenario where you're scared or you have to fight for your life, your body will increase blood pressure. Our body will respond by vasodilating, causing a decrease in blood pressure. Once that scenario is over, we can return back to a balanced normal blood pressure. Our next example is a positive feedback loop. Remember, this is different. This is some of our rarer, less numerous types of feedback loops. This is causing a disruption instead of responding to a disruption like we saw in our previous negative feedback loop. So let's look at the scenario. We have contractions of the uterine wall, which is going to force the baby's head or body into the cervix. This is increasing. So we are pregnant, 40 weeks has elapsed. We now have to get the baby out of our body. So we're calling for a disruption to have the baby pushed through the uterus. So, we have stretching on the cervix, that's our controlled conditions. Receptors are going to detect those stretching, and it's going to send input impulses to the brain. The brain's going to set output impulses saying release oxytocin to help uterine contractions, which will allow that uterus to contract more forcibly, pushing the body out and stretching the cervix. From there, the baby is pushed out or delivered. So increased stretching of the cervix causes the release of more oxytocin, which results in more stretching of the cervix. Once the baby is gone, this feedback loop shuts off. So again, we're causing for a disruption, more hormone secretion, more muscle contraction, okay, to help get that baby out. Once that baby's out, we return back to homeostasis. So let's look at some homeostatic imbalances. What ensues? When homeostasis is disrupted, it can result in disease, disorder, or on the worst case scenario, even death. What are factors that can affect this? Well, your genetic makeup is one. The air you breathe, the food you eat, and the thoughts you think can all affect your health. You say, well, that's weird. What is it about our thoughts? Stress. Stress puts us in a constant negative feedback loop. This is bad. We're releasing too much cortisol, and too much cortisol for a duration on our body is not good. Basic anatomical terminology. There are different types of anatomical terminology. 1 body positions, 2 regional names, 3 directional terms, 4 planes and sections, 5 body cavities. Let's look at body positions. There is something that is called the correct anatomical position. This is when the person stands erect, facing the observer. The upper extremities are placed at the side. The palms of the hand are turned forward. This is called a supine position. This is extremely important because it puts the thumbs outwards and the pinky towards the body. The feet are flat on the floor, shoulder width apart. Now, anatomical position is important. It's a standardized method of observing or imaging the body that allows precise and, more importantly, consistent anatomical reference. Before we get into regional names, the picture on the left, the girl marked number 1, is in correct anatomical position. She is facing forward, the hands are in a supinated position, feet shoulder width apart. Now, let's look at regional names. This is extremely important. Remember we talked about building a building? Well, this is our foundation. By learning these surface terms, this will make bones, muscle, nerves, arteries and veins, and a lot of other structures 1,000 times easier. So what names do we need to know? So there's a lot of words bolded, bracketed. We're going to stay with the words that are not bracketed, like mental, sternal, mammary, manual, pubic, femoral, patellar, palmar, etc., etc., etc. My best suggestion here is to go through all the different surface terms, put them to note card, and start memorizing them. Next is directional terms. Directional terms are used to precisely locate one part of the body relative to another. So let's start with superior and inferior. We can think basic English terminology, then apply this scientific word. So, for example, above and below, superior versus inferior. The head is what? To the chest. So in your head you're saying, well, the head's above the chest, so we would use the word superior. If we flip it, the chest is what to the head, we'd use the word inferior. Next is going to be anterior and posterior, to the front and to the back. We can see that our sternum, so this is this breastbone right here, is what to our vertebra all the way in our back. So we would say it's in front of, so we'd use the word anterior. Or we can say the vertebra is what to the sternum, behind, so the word we'd use is posterior. Next is medial and lateral. We're going to put another word in here called intermediate. Okay, so we're going to have 3 words here. For medial and lateral is going to be our preferred terminology. So for example, medial means more towards the midline, lateral means more towards the outer aspects of our body. So our nose is what to our ear? you would say it's more towards the midline, so it's medial. Our ear is what to our eye? Lateral. Now, if I said, I chose my words very carefully. If I said my nose is what to my eyes, you can use the word medial, but a more precise word would be intermediate. Any singular structure between two identical structures, we use the word intermediate. For example, the abdominal aorta runs between both kidneys. So the aorta is what to the kidneys? We would say intermediate. The next one that's a little bit tricky are these, proximal and distal. Look at the words. Proximal sounds like close. Distal sounds like far. So close versus far. So close to far to what? Here, a point of attachment. So we're talking about joints, attachments. Okay? So now we can reference two specific things and say, what is their directional term? So the humerus is what? To the ulna. So it is closer. So if we draw a line from one to the other, whoever has the closer line will be proximal. Whoever has the longer line will be distal. For example, the humerus is proximal to the ulna. But if we flipped it and said the ulna is what to the humerus, it's further away from that point of attachment. So we use the word distal. This table goes through all our directional terms. We've covered most of them. There's a few more we're going to look at. Ipsilateral and contralateral. Ipsilateral is used when we're talking about structures on the same side of the body. Contralateral is going to be used for opposite sides of the body. We're going to refer back to this terminology when we get to reflexes. Reflex that happens on the same side versus the opposite side. The other two definitions we haven't talked about are superficial and deep. Superficial is more towards the surface of the body, whereas deep is more away from the body, or, well, deeper. For example, the ribs are superficial to the lungs, or the skin is superficial to the muscles, yet the muscles are deep to the skin. So that's how we use those two words. Planes and sections. How do we cut the body? Planes are imaginary flat surfaces that are used to divide the body. So for example, if we take the body and cut it directly down the center, splitting it into equal left and right halves, this will give us a specific mid-sagittal plane. Notice I said equal left and right halves. It goes to the midline of the body. Any plane or cut parallel to that cut is called the parasagittal cut. If we take a cut and cut the body into anterior and posterior portions, so anterior, posterior portions, this is known as a frontal or coronal plane. Let's make another cut called the transverse plane, transverse cut, which is going to cut the body into superior and inferior portions. The fourth and last plane that we're going to look at is an oblique plane. This is a 45-degree cut to any one of our aforementioned planes, and it will be used to also help identify muscles. You've heard of these, your oblique muscles and your abdominals. Okay? We'll also see oblique muscles running on this 45-degree angle in the stomach, etc. Why are these planes and sections important? Different cuts and different planes give us different views into similar organs. So let's look at this brain right here. Which plane would be the preferred cut to look at the majority of structures found in the human brain? The answer is this mid-sagittal cut. That's why most models that we use in lab are cut mid-sagittally, because we get to see all the structures of the midbrain, the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the thalamus, the pons, the medulla oblongata, the spinal cord. Whereas if we cut frontally, we don't really see much. We can see some gray matter, some white matter, maybe the ventricles here, but we lose aspect to the majority of structures. Even on a transverse plane, again, we see the ventricles, we maybe see some fissures here, some gyri and sulci, some terms when we get to the nervous system we'll talk about again, so don't worry too much, but we don't have as much specificity. Another example, if I said to you, give me a cut that I can see both kidneys, well, a mid-sagittal plane will not give you that. It's going to cut right between them. You're not going to see any kidneys. A frontal plane will let you see all the internal anatomy of both kidneys, whereas a transverse plane will look down onto those kidneys and you might not see as much internal structures. So a frontal plane would be preferred. So all these different cuts are important when looking at different organs. Body cavities. Body cavities are spaces within the body that help protect, separate, and support internal organs. We have three basic body cavities. 1. Cranial cavity, which includes the vertebral canal. The cranial cavity is formed by cranial bones and contains the brain. The vertebral canal is formed by the vertebral column and contains spinal cord and the beginning of spinal nerves. The next cavity inferior to that is the thoracic cavity. This is our chest cavity. It contains the pleura and pericardial cavities of the mediastinum. So you're hearing words like pleura or pericardial cavities, right? We're talking about serous membranes that we will deal with in a little bit. So our pleural cavity is a potential space between the layers of the pleura that surround the lungs. The pericardial cavity is a potential space between the layers of the pericardium that surround the heart. Now the mediastinal cavity, the mediastinum, is this rectangular shaped portion that extends from right on top of the sternum, extending down to the diaphragm in a nice little rectangle. It is the central portion of the thoracic cavity between the lungs. It extends from the sternum to the vertebral column and from the first rib to the diaphragm. It's going to contain the heart, major blood vessels, thymus, esophagus, trachea. Our last cavity is a combination of two cavities, the abdominal pelvic cavity, which includes the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity is going to contain all those digestive organs, the stomach, the spleen, the liver, the gallbladder, the small intestine, and most of the large intestine. It's going to have a serous membrane that's going to protect those organs called the peritoneum. The pelvic cavity contains your genital organs like the urinary bladder, portions of the large intestine, and internal organs of reproduction. Serous membranes. We looked at these and hinted to these in the last slide. Now let's define them. Serous membranes are thin, double-layered membranes that cover the viscera within the thoracic and abdominal cavities and also line the walls of the thorax and abdomen. Those two layers are named whether they are closer to the organ, or inner layer, or further away, or outer layer. The innermost layer is known as the visceral layer. The outermost layer is known as the parietal. Now, I use a little trick to help me understand this. If you think about what do nurses use to administer fluids in the hospital, you think of an IV, right? So that IV stands for inner visceral. If you think about the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, what comes next? O, P, outer parietal. Now, what's the overall function of this membrane? It is there to reduce friction. Let's look at the serous membranes in the thoracic cavity. We have the pericardium, which surrounds the heart, and pleura, that's going to cover the heart and lungs, respectively. So let's take a look at the pericardium, the layer surrounding the heart. We have the outermost layer, known as the parietal pericardium, the innermost layer that's fused to the outer muscle of the heart called the visceral pericardium. I want to point out to you that little rectangle. That's our mediastinal cavity. That brings us to our pleura, the covering of the lungs. Each lung has its own pleura. The layer that is fused to the actual lung is called the, remember, inner visceral, so visceral pleura. On the outside that's stuck to the rib cage is our outer parietal. Let's take a transverse cut and look at the serous membranes in the thoracic cavity. Again, we have the heart here with our pericardium. So we'll circle this in black. And again, look at the space between the parietal layer and the visceral layer is a cavity. This pleural cavity is where fluid is going to flow. So that pleural cavity is super important because in the lungs, especially if you get an infection, bacterial or viral infection, it can cause swelling of those layers. It is called pleurisy. And the same thing with the heart. If that those heart membranes get infected, it is called pericarditis. The abdominal cavity has its own serous membrane. It is known as the peritoneum. It covers many of the abdominal organs. There is another word we have to talk about, retroperitoneal, meaning behind the peritoneum. The classification, some organs are given because they are not surrounded by the peritoneum, rather they're behind it. So, example, the kidneys. They are not surrounded by this peritoneal membranes of the peritoneum, and as a result are termed retroperitoneal. Next, we look at divisions of the abdominal pelvic cavity. We're going to use regions and quadrants. Now, regions are going to be our anatomical divisions, so let's write this out for you. Anatomical divisions, whereas quadrants are going to be our clinical divisions. So in a hospital setting, you are more likely to use quadrants than you would regions. Now, how does this work? Let's start with regions. We take the two nipples, we draw a line straight down from each nipple. We go a line above and below the belly button. Now, here's where we name these regions. We say, let's start right in the middle. It's like a tic-tac-toe. By the belly button, if you go back to surface terms, umbilical is that region, so we call it the umbilical region. Now we have this stomach region, right? Digestive region here. We're going to go above and below the digestive region. So epi, so prefixes and suffixes here for Latin are super important. Epigastric means above the digestive region. Hypogastric means below the digestive region. Now we go right in the lower back. Think about your car. If you have support for your lower back that pushes out, this is called lumbar support. Go back to surface terms, lumbar region. Left and right, lumbar region. Now, where do people make a mistake? I'll say to them, let's look at the spleen, which is over here, right? And they say, what region or what anatomical division is the spleen in? Some people are going to say it is the right hypochondriac. And then we say, why? Are they right or wrong? And the answer is wrong. It is the left. You have to always remember correct anatomical position. Put yourself in the plane of the person. So left. So we did right lumbar, left lumbar. Let's look at our inner groin. Go back to surface terms. We're inguinal. So left inguinal region, right inguinal region. That brings us to hypochondriac. Now, you're hearing the word hypochondriac and you're thinking, oh, this is somebody who's always thinking that they're sick. Not here. This is a direct translation. Hypo, meaning below, and chondro, meaning cartilage. And you say, well, what cartilage are we below? Well, we're below the costal cartilage of the ribs. So we have left hypochondriac and right hypochondriac. Those are our anatomical divisions or regions. Next is pretty simple, quadrants. It is simply a cross. The belly button is where those lines segment, and we make 4 boxes. Now we just name them. Left upper quadrant, left lower quadrant, right lower quadrant, right upper. Now we do scenarios. The gallbladder, here it is right here. What clinical division is it found in? Now you hear that word clinical, you should be thinking quadrants right away. So you will say right upper quadrant. The appendix, here it is in what clinical division? You would say right lower quadrant. The spleen is in what anatomical division? Now look, I tried to trick you. I said anatomical division. You should be thinking region. So you would say left hypochondriac region. If I said clinical division or quadrant, you would say left upper quadrant or LUQ. Finally, we talk about aging and homeostasis. Aging is a normal process characterized by a progressive decline in the body's ability to restore homeostasis. So as we get older, hormone levels drop, compliance with our lungs, ease of breathing, cardiovascular system declines, our body's systems that are responding to the stimuli are losing the ability to respond appropriately. So with aging, everything is seen to decline.